Great question. Why does it seem like host species tolerate the blood drinkers like vampire bats, vampire finches, and this oxpecker drinking blood from their wounds? And the answer depends on which of the blood drinkers we're talking about. So the relationship between vampire bats and their host animals from which they drink blood, and we'll talk about them in a second, is very different than the relationship we see between the sanguivorous birds like the vampire finch and the oxpeckers that drink blood and their host animals, because these birds still maintain strong mutualisms with their host species, even though occasionally they might open a wound to drink the blood. So opening or expanding a wound so that it bleeds more so you can drink up the blood is obviously parasitic behavior. That is not beneficial to the host antelope, for example. But both vampire finches and the oxpeckers form mutualisms with these same animals they sometimes parasitize for blood by removing ectoparasites. Notice this oxpecker's beak is absolutely full of ticks that it pulled off the same antelope that a little later it might feed from the wounds that those ticks created. And it's really important to note here that unlike the vampire bats that eat a diet of nothing but blood, blood makes up only about 10% of the diets of the vampire finch and the oxpeckers, which suggests that the benefits of the mutualism, where vampire finches or oxpeckers are eating primarily ectoparasites, outweighs the potential costs of the occasional blood parasitism by these same bird species. So when it comes to blood drinking in vampire bats, it's pure parasitism. Their host species do not benefit from the interaction at all. And because of that, vampire bats have a number of adaptations that they use to mask their presence, increasing the likelihood that they get a blood meal before the host animal even knows that they were there. So vampire bats have evolved proteins in their saliva that are both anesthetics and anticoagulants. And in addition to that, they've evolved heat receptors in their noses. And they use those heat receptors to find the thin-skinned areas of their host, whether it's a pig or a donkey or a tapir, where the blood is just under the surface. And once they find that spot, they then start to lick it, applying the anesthetic, numbing the area so that when they make the incision with their razor-sharp front teeth, the animal doesn't feel it. And the anticoagulants in their saliva keep the wound from closing up and healing, thus they can just sit there and drink, and the host animal is none the wiser. And so whether or not a host animal tolerates a blood drinker seems to have everything to do with whether or not those animals have a mutualism, where they both benefit through the association even though there are occasional costs of parasitism, versus what we see in vampire bats, where it's pure parasitism with no benefit to the host species, and thus we see host species trying to kick bats away all the time, whereas we don't see host species kicking oxpeckers and vampire finches off their bodies.